welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I'm Julie Wilson. I'm on the faculty here. And tonight we're going to discuss a number of the proposals for addressing immigration into the United States. I just want to start out with a few facts so that we're all on the same page. In 2002, the last year for which we have data, there were 34.5 million foreign-born individuals living in the United States. Almost 1 in 3 of these had become naturalized citizens. 1 in 4 were undocumented, and the remainder were legally here but not yet citizens. Early in our history, of course, a large share of our residents were foreign-born or the children of foreign-born. Between 1870 and 1920, about 1 in 7 U.S. residents was foreign-born. The foreign-born share declined after that point until 1970 when it began rising again. Today, about 11% of the residents of the United States are foreign-born. Over the last 4 decades, as we've all been made aware, the source of immigrants has changed, shifting predominantly from European countries to predominantly Latin American and Asian countries. Now, foreign-born residents make up 14% of our workforce, and during the 90s, they were 1 out of 2 of every new workers. We have an outstanding panel tonight to talk about where we are and where we should head next in the whole topic of immigration. First to my left, the Honorable Jim Colby, who's currently serving his 11th term representing Arizona's 8th Congressional District. He's a proponent of immigration reform and has recently submitted temporary worker program legislation. Among his committee assignments is membership on the House Appropriations Committee and chair of its subcommittee on foreign operations, export financing, and related programs. Mark Krikorian is executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization in Washington, D.C., which examines and critiques the impact of immigration in the United States. The center is animated by a pro-immigrant, low-immigration vision, which seeks fewer immigrants but a warmer welcome for those admitted. To his left is the Honorable Ron Mazzoli, who served the state of Kentucky in the U.S. Congress from 1971 to 1995, where he chaired the Immigration, International Law, and Refugee Subcommittee. He was co-sponsor of the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, often referred to as Simpson-Mazzoli. Key provisions of that bill included amnesty for then undocumented workers and provisions for sanctioning employers who knowingly hire undocumented immigrants. And we can't let Ron get by without saying that he graduated from the mid-career program at the Kennedy School recently.
Great time.
And on the other end, at the end, is Doris Meisner, who is currently a senior associate of the Global Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Earlier in her career, she founded the endowment's International Migration Policy Program. She left that program in 1993 to serve as commissioner of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, then the INS, under President Bill Clinton. I'd like to start with you, Representative Colby. President Bush recently proposed an immigration reform plan that would enable 8 million illegal immigrants to obtain legal status as temporary workers. And you filed legislation to support this. What are the strengths of this proposal? Why should we do this?
Well, I think, of course, the president hasn't filed a specific bill. He's been very general in the principles that he's talked about, although he has, in this case, said that he thought the legislation which Senator McCain, Congressman Flake, and I have introduced is the model that he would like to see us follow. So he's publicly said, he hasn't endorsed our bill, but he said it's the direction he thought we should go. What are the reasons for it? Why do we need this? Why should we go this direction? I believe there's a growing sense in this country that immigration is out of control. Whether true or not, there's a growing sense that we do not have the control over our borders. And I think that's probably true in the sense that the number of people coming in illegally continues to be very large. The number that come in through by simply overstaying their visas continues to be very large. My view is that it's an economic issue. It's an economic problem. In other words, there are jobs here on this side of the border and people outside of the country who are willing to take the jobs at the price that's being offered. So it's an economic problem, and we need to have an economic solution. A guest worker program is an economic solution because it says to people, if you want to come here to work, you may come here. That doesn't give you permanent residency, it doesn't give you permanent status. You're not here as a citizen, but you're entitled to work in this country. And it takes away a lot of the problems. Now, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with guest work, and we'll have a chance to talk about some of these here tonight. But I think by and large, if you have a broad, and it's got to be broad, a guest worker program, so that it covers, it's not limited. If you try to limit it, then you're going to always have another group that's going to try to come in outside of those limits. And the second part of it that you have to deal with is those that are already here. So any guest worker program has to deal with two components: people that are here now in an illegal status, and the next group that will want to come in, the next wave that will want to come in after them. If you don't, and that I think was the failure in 1986, we didn't deal with the next group. We said we were going to enforce the law. We didn't really have the enforcement mechanisms to do that. And so if you don't deal with both parts of that, I think you're simply going to have the next wave of the problem.
Yeah. Mark, you're on record as thinking this is not a good idea.
It's not. And, and both pieces of it are the problem. The first assumption of this approach of amnestying the illegals who are here, because if they get legal status, that's what an amnesty is, and then creating a mechanism for the legal importation of future workers, the basic assumption is that immigration isn't controllable, that there's really nothing we can do about the illegal population here other than amnesty them, and there's nothing we can do to actually control the inflow of people because there's some kind of overwhelming economic necessity for them that the government is simply incapable of managing or controlling. And so the solution, I mean, the president's principles and all of the people who have talked about this and presented legislation essentially is based on the idea that we need to lie back and pretend to enjoy it and kind of dress it up somehow so that it seems like we have control over what's going on. So we fool ourselves into thinking we have control, but in fact, we simply allow forces that are beyond our control, like the weather or the tides, to simply do their work. And nothing could be further from the truth. Immigration is not something that responds purely to economic pull, to economic demand, or even push factors from overseas. The only way an economic demand and a push factor from overseas are hooked up is through networks. Nobody wakes up in Uruguay and says, today I'm going to move to Methuen. People go where they have friends, where they have relatives, where they have connections, and government policy like these proposed guest worker programs, like our guest worker program with Mexico from the 50s and the early 60s, create these networks. And in a sense, make sort of this idea of inevitable immigration self-fulfilling, because immigration always creates more immigration. We bring people in as guest workers. They have relatives. They have friends. Those people want to come in as guest workers. And there's really the assumption that we can't control that is false. But in fact, if we have programs to import people, we are sparking further immigration. So,
how do you respond to employers who say we really don't have the labor force we need? We need to bring people into the country.
This is an urban myth about jobs Americans won't do. The work that immigrants do is going to get done whether immigrants are here or not. And if the supply of immigrant workers were restricted, it's not as though magically they'd all disappear tomorrow. It would be a sort of a gradual restriction in the flow of foreign workers. Employers would do two things. One, they would offer more money, better benefits, different working conditions to recruit and retrain people who are already here. And let's not forget places like the Central Valley of California, for instance, very immigrant-dependent agriculture is based there. They have double-digit unemployment all the time, regardless of economic conditions elsewhere. But at the same time, employers will find ways of eliminating some of the jobs that shouldn't exist, that exist only because there's low-skilled workers to do them. They will replace the labor with capital, which is what modern economies should be doing. I don't want to compete with Brazil and Mexico on labor cost. I want to use our competitive advantage in technology and capital in order to be able to compete effectively against places like that.
Jim, do you?
Well, I just don't think that works when it comes to talking about things like picking asparagus. You can do some technology, and we do a lot of technology in agriculture, but there's a lot of just labor-intensive things. It's the people changing the beds in hotels and so forth, and washing the dishes. It's by and large, it's going to be very hard to find Americans to do those kinds of jobs. We have a relatively low unemployment rate at 5%. It's pretty low, and there's just an awful lot of jobs out there that are going to go begging. And to come back to the earlier point, if you simply say, you know, we can always find people that can do these jobs, and we don't need to import these kinds of people. It just begs the issue, it seems to me, of what the fundamental problem is, and that is that you've got, that it is an economic issue. You've got people out there to do these jobs. It just isn't going to work. We've had drug laws on the books for 100 years. And we haven't been able to fix that problem. So why do we suddenly think, you know, just enforce the laws, then we can talk about some other kind of immigration fix here?
If I could just briefly respond, the analogy that people often use is either drug laws or prohibition or speeding, 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on the highway. All of what those things all share is that there are intrinsic characteristics that make it difficult to enforce the immigration law. Drug laws. Drugs create a biological craving, an addiction that is physiological and can't simply be legislated away. Speed limits are the same thing. The interstate highway is engineered for 70 miles an hour. It exists. It was built with the intent of driving 70 miles an hour, not 55 miles an hour. The labor market does not have some objective fixed demand for immigrant labor. The supply of immigrant labor distorts the development of these industries. So farms or farmers may well decide, I have low-skilled, cheap labor from Mexico. I'm going to grow strawberries instead of growing carrots, because carrots I could harvest by machine. Strawberries I probably can't. My solution would be, frankly, my answer to farmers, for instance, who might not be able to produce asparagus without foreign hand labor, is maybe we ought to be buying the asparagus from Mexico or the Dominican Republic and have the people stay home and grow the stuff, and have our farmers grow carrots or something else that can be harvested mechanically.
Well, if I could chime in just for a second. First, with great respect to you, Professor, you used the term amnesty, as my friend Mark did. Really, the programs that we did back in '86 and the program which Congressman Colby would support, and the one that apparently President Bush supports, are really not amnesties. They're earned. You have to be here for a certain number of years. You have to work. You have to be clean of any kind of criminal record. You have to have paid taxes and all the things that I would say constitute fiery hoops you have to jump through before you can qualify. So I think we do a disservice to the issue of immigration by using the term amnesty, which is an inflammatory kind of word, and which contemplates, I think, what President Carter did when I was still in Congress, which is to basically wave a wand and then make good all the people who had, you know, defected because of the Vietnam War. That's an amnesty. This is an earned situation. Secondly, when you talk about the networks, and Mark is exactly right, these are networks. There are certain states in Mexico which have sent the bulk of the people into the country. You can't, just like you cannot untangle a plate of spaghetti, you cannot untangle these networks. They are there. And so we have to deal with it. So how do you deal with it? Well, you deal with it in a multifaceted way. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of whatever passes, and I think that maybe the President's discussion here, which is not yet a bill, fails because it isn't multifaceted or manifold enough. You just don't have the elements that I think we tried to bring in 1986. We had some of the same things facing us then. We had an illegal population in the country. We had farmers and other employers saying that they could not get labor because you couldn't pay enough. And if you were to pay it, you still couldn't get people to do some of these dead-end jobs. So what Senator Simpson, who's very well known to the Kennedy School, having been the director of IOP, did, and I assisted him in that effort, was to put together a bipartisan bill, Democrat, Republican, Senate, House, that did three things, and Al used to call it a three-legged stool. One leg of it was a legalization program, which did do something to help people in the country for then, prior to 1982, earn their way through to legal status. A second thing was to provide something for the farms and the agricultural interests. Today, I think the guest worker bill would be much more encompassing, different backgrounds than just simply agriculture. And the third was employer sanctions, which if you really get down to the heart of it, while we're as a nation ambivalent about immigration, we are frightened and off-put by some aspects of it, but we're very much enveloped by other aspects. The truth of the matter is there has been a reluctance on the part of many administrations to really enforce employer sanctions. Were it to be enforced, I think that would be one aspect of the bill, but I think that if the president is going to push just a guest worker program, however layered it is and nuanced that might be, if he just stops there and doesn't do much of anything else, I don't see it going very far. I think that it has to be, once again, some type of a more comprehensive bill if it were to succeed.
If the employer sanctions were enforced, if they had been enforced, where would we be now? What would the situation
Well, I think
be?
we'd be farther down the line, because I think it would have illustrated more clearly the fact that we need some presence of immigrant labor in the country. Because, again, I get back to the point which we discussed at length, and Commissioner Meisner was with us in those days in the 80s and 90s. We found that there was a situation where, unlike that Kevin Costner film where if you create a field, they will come, you can put the dollar signs out there and they will not come for certain jobs. They're either too arduous, they're too dead end, they're too burdensome, but they just don't have the future thing of it, and so U.S. people may not want to do them. And so I think that if there were an enforcement of employer sanctions, with the one element to give honest employers a simple, clear-cut way to determine the qualification to work, something like we swipe a Visa card or something. Mm-hmm. But something like that, which Al and I talked about, but which the successive administrations didn't really get into, if you had that kind of a fail-safe way to verify labor and the quality and the qualification to work, I think we would have crystallized the issue, and we would have had a guest worker program before now. We would have had less illegal entry, more legal entry, and I think we would have had still the vibrant economy that we have today.
Dorit, what did it look like as commissioner?
Well, let me just pick up on what Congressman Mazzoli has said, because the three-legged stool idea really was so indelible at that time as part of the debate. But it does illustrate that there have to be a set of things working together in order for a problem like this to be addressed. And even then, we don't know really whether we would be able to get on top of this problem, because a lot of it really does now have to do with the international marketplace, global interdependence, the connectedness of labor markets, and our own demographics. Which is a country that is an aging society where we are not replacing ourselves, and where new entrants to the labor market are fundamentally foreign-born. And it's saving us right now in terms of our productivity as compared to all the other advanced industrial societies in the world. But that doesn't mean that it should be done through enormous amounts of illegal labor where the rule of law is undercut in the process, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's fair to say that in 1986, the big achievement of Senator Simpson and Congressman Mazzoli was to at least get the idea of employer responsibility established. However, I think everybody would agree, and I think the sponsors most of all would agree, that it's an insufficient law. It's weak. They couldn't get nearly as far with it as they needed to, and it has not been funded since 1986. If you look at the appropriations, it is a flat line from 1986 till now. So it's a law that is filled with loopholes, but most importantly, does not give employers, what's been said here, a surefire way of validating who it is that they're hiring. And the federal government has not put resources into implementing a law, and even when you try to implement it, which I have had some experience with, you cannot do it.
Indeed.
So we need to learn from that. And the real underlying problem, in my opinion, is that we haven't wanted to do that. We have wanted to say, border enforcement, border enforcement, border enforcement. We have poured billions into border enforcement. And we have made enormous strides in border enforcement, but you cannot enforce the border when the message is, if you get past us, there is a job for you in this country. Because the pressure is too great, and you cannot do this job with just one kind of enforcement. You need a whole set of things working together. And until we're prepared to have employers be able to be responsible for their behavior, and in return for that, have a labor supply that meets their needs, we are never going to be able to solve this problem, no matter what we do at the border.
I just want to reinforce, I agree with the things that you just said, and I just want to reinforce what Doris said there, and that is that the way the bill was set up, the way the law was set up, it was really almost set up to fail. That's certainly not what the intention of Ron and Senator Simpson, but it was really almost set up to fail because you put the employer in the impossible position of being the determinant of who is in here in a legal situation or not. That's why you need to have something that's clear-cut, that's simple. And the legislation we have with visas would do that, where you'd have like you have the transportation safety. I'm in that frequent flyer program where you just go in and they take a retina scan and boom, like that. They tell you, okay, you're you're cleared to go. The technology for that kind of thing exists today. We need to have that on a visa so we can identify the person's carrying the visa with the person who actually shows up to make sure that it's the right person there. But if you do that, then you've got something that you can go after employers otherwise. But as it is now, it isn't much good to put a lot of money into enforcement of the law with employers, because it's just an impossible one to go after. You have to prove the intent of the employer to hire those people illegally, and that's so impossible. That's why no one ever gets convicted.
We're all sort of in the improbable position of kind of agreeing with each other. But I'd have to say that we don't need to wait for some magic solution before we start enforcing the law. There's plenty that we can do now, and Doris's assertion is exactly correct. We have not wanted to enforce the law. And in fact, when people in the Immigration Service have tried to enforce the law, they've been publicly humiliated, slapped down by lawmakers and their own superiors in the administration, and often even forced into retirement. So the fact is, we could start enforcing the law if we wanted to with whatever resources we have, and nobody wants to do it. And that, I would have to say, is precisely the reason that some kind of vast amnesty and guest worker program is a mistake, because if we're not enforcing the immigration law today, there is absolutely no reason to expect that it's going to be enforced after a program like this is enacted, and it will simply supercharge illegal immigration rather than somehow solve the problem.
Doris?
I have to disagree. I mean, I don't think that you really can try to enforce the law now where employers are concerned. You can, but it is not a useful expenditure of resources. I mean, it's simple, and I speak from quite bitter experience with this in attempting in the 1990s to really do some fairly serious efforts at bringing big cases, at mobilizing the resources that were available in ways that presumably would send a message to other employers, et cetera. It is not doable under the current, as Congressman Colby has said, system of asking employers of the dilemma that they have in trying to fill out the forms that they're filling out and so forth. This is a total wink and a nod psychology that we're living in this country at the present time. Employers fill out all those forms. You all show your documents when you get a new job or whatever else. It is all paperwork and process. Everybody that needs to has a fraudulent document. Every employer can say, I saw something that looked like it was okay. What do you expect me to be a document expert? I don't have, passport readers on my desk, et cetera, et cetera. It's not, the equation has to be changed.
Well, this is the other thing I agree with Doris on. We do, in fact, need to implement and roll out the verification system that actually INS started to develop when Doris was there.
Exactly.
And
right.
in fact, it was almost killed last year. It was reauthorized, but only through some prodigious efforts on the part of people who are interested in immigration control.
Well, I remember often visiting the commissioner in her office after she had one of her tete-a-tetes on Capitol Hill with some of our colleagues, and I mean, she sometimes was ashen and drawn because they had just really, I think quite improperly, dumped on her some of these frustrations that we see. And one of the things that Al and I did, and I appreciate what Doris said about the fact that most of this young audience would not remember that prior to 1986, we had what was called the Texas Proviso, which said that anyone who would harbor illegal aliens and hire them and so forth with impunity was free, but the individual who was hired could be sent back to Mexico or be sent back to Guatemala or wherever they were from. And so we changed that and made it an offense for the employer to knowingly hire. And we also put in there, and Doris attempted over her years as commissioner to try to implement these various uses of electronic data, and we didn't have biometric in those days, but we had things that at least allowed you to swipe credit cards, and something like that could have been done. But zero response and no money, and so we are where we are today with a law on the books, which I guess is unenforceable, but I think it needs, until we do something, not to be just ignored either. I think if we were to just sort of pass it by entirely, I think we're going to let some of these unconscionable employers off the hook. One last thing I'd say, and a lot of what we say in the panel, because I want to say Mark was my guest when I was here as a visiting fellow, as was Doris, and we had great sessions with our study groups. But we said then, I say now, and I said back in 1981 and all the way through, we as a nation are ambivalent about this subject, and it makes Jim's job almost impossible in Capitol Hill to make public policy where the people are riven. The people themselves have disputes about what is the proper way to go. And without a unanimity, without an understanding on the part of the voter and public, it makes the job on Capitol Hill almost impossible. And when you're ambivalent about this, as we are, individually we know wonderful people that we want to stay in this country even though they may not have documents because they're our kind of people. We know at the same time that in vast numbers this becomes a huge social and economic, educational, healthcare problem. But we have this change of view, we have this ambivalence that makes public policy very much more difficult to pursue.
Let me shift the questioning just a little bit. Right now there's just a huge backlog of work to be done, applications to be read, all sorts of work. How do we get caught up on that? How do we change to some of the systems that you've talked about in the face of a large budget deficit and an attempt to cut the deficit?
Well, let me start with that.
Actually,
where backlogs are concerned, back up a minute and say that we would all agree that the system is broken. And one of the things that is broken about the system is not only the large numbers of illegal immigrants that we have, it is that if you try to play by the rules, you are enormously frustrated in trying to do what's right. So that there is almost, the coin of the realm almost is it's backwards. And playing by the rules is a problem because it often takes very long, not to mention that the procedures are very convoluted, it's a very complex law, et cetera, et cetera. However, that is not connected to the budget deficit, really, because we do charge people that are trying to use the system properly a fee to do so. So that is actually self-sustaining. And you can, change those revenue amounts if you need to, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, the Congress sometimes likes to dip into those accounts and use some of that money for other things, such as detention and things that it was not, intended for. But that actually, I think, is much more fixable. And administratively, you need to run a system in a way that encourages people to at least use the laws that are there. Now, the problem is a bigger one than that, and that is that even if you want to try to use the laws, there is not enough room in our system for the numbers of people that legitimately could be brought into the country. I mean, for instance, in 1990, we eliminated any opportunity under the immigration law for unskilled people to come here legally. Well, what are we talking about in terms of the demand in our workforce? It's largely an unskilled workforce demand, and there are lots of other examples like that.
We've made some progress, too, in reducing those backlogs. Actually, some of the backlogs have come down very substantially, but there is a huge problem, as Doris has correctly pointed out. And one of the problems is that since 9/11, And we all remember Atta and the others who got the few of them that got their visas in the mail 6 months later after they had crashed the planes into them. They were delivered in the mail to them. What is the message that the person processing those visas gets? If I don't do anything, I'm not going to get in trouble. And all too often, that's exactly the message that we send is to the bureaucrat is don't take any action and you don't get in trouble. So it's easier to sit on a visa, especially if there's even the slightest question about it. It's easier to sit on it than it is to process it and do something with it. And I think that's become part of the backlog. And it has serious implications, I think, for us as a society. It certainly has serious implications for universities, not being able to get students and faculty members. And it's a huge problem.
If I could pick out something Doris said, essentially, it's true that much of the backlog results from a mismatch between what we promise, what we hold out as possible, and what we actually offer, which is to say that the number of people who qualify for immigration to the United States is millions higher than the available number of green cards. And so the solution, it seems to me, is obvious. Either increase the number of green cards by millions every year, or reduce the categories of people that we are promising green cards to. And I think Barbara Jordan's Immigration Reform Commission really had this right when they essentially said, we need to decide who it is we want to let in, what kinds of people, and then make it possible for all of them to come in every year. So in other words, define the problem narrowly, but make sure that all of those people in those narrowly defined categories are able to come in without having to be wait in some queue for 20 years.
I'm delighted that Mark mentioned Barbara Jordan because I had the privilege of sitting next to Barbara on the Judiciary Committee for a number of years, and she was an amazing representative and a wonderful voice for lots of causes. And I believe that had she lived to bring her panel's work to fruition, I think we would not be in quite the mess we are today. I think we would have probably had that clarion voice, that stentorian voice that nobody could ignore, leading the charge, and as Mark said, talking about some things which were awkward. I mean, she talked about fourth and fifth preferences, brothers and sisters and things like that to make us focus more on the close-in family rather than the more spread-out family. She also talked about Americanization, what it means to be acculturated or assimilated. I mean, she was talking about things which almost like they talk about the third rail, Social Security being the third rail. She was talking about the third rail when it came to immigration, only she was taken away, soon thereafter, and therefore she wasn't to see it. One thought, and I'm always amazed when I see Father Ted Hesburgh, who was, when I was at Notre Dame back in the 50s, was named president as a mere 35-year-old man and was president for 35 years. And during that time, as Doris and Mark and Jim well remember, headed up the Commission on Immigration Reform, which eventually yielded the outlines of what became the 86 Act. And Father Hesburgh said back in 1981 that unless you close the back door, you'll not be able to keep the front door open, which is to say, unless you keep people from just coming in the country by the hordes, in the illegal way, you're not going to keep the front door open through which my own father came from Italy many years ago, through which many people in this room have come, and we hope many future generations will come. Because then, if you don't differentiate between these factors of legal, illegal, and if you don't recognize the front door, back door, then it's easy to get pretty emotional about this and just say to heck with all of it, and we'll just slam the door and be done with it. So I think that Father Hesburgh, who's alive and very well today in South Bend, would agree that if we can do something about the back door through a series of different measures, then we will be able to keep the front door open, and that's been the vibrance of our nation.
Well, let me ask two questions. You can take them up in whatever. One is, what's the best strategy for closing the back door? And two, if you open the front door, how do we decide who we want to invite in?
Well, let me just quickly say, I think we've talked about how you close the back door. You can't just close it by trying to build more fences, though I guess this Real ID Act would propose to do some of that. I think you have to do that. You have to be aware of the terrorism threat. I mean, all these things are real. But I think that partly, just like Mark said, you got to do something about the push factor. Do something in these countries. You have to do something, as Doris said, about the pull factor, which is jobs that are here that are dangled across the line. I think that you have to do that on a multifaceted way. And then as far as who should come in the front door, I think that we've had a pretty good mix. I mean, you're talking about close family, you're talking about skilled people. You are, and my own father was unskilled, and it's important, I think, we not forget unskilled labor as a part of this mix as well. But close-in family, when Al and I got our bill cooking in '86 or before that, we did at different times have changes on the fourth and fifth preference, which I guess are they still called the fourth and fifth
You
preference?
might tell them what fourth and fifth
Yeah.
preference are.
Well, the fourth and fifth are brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens, married brothers and sisters, adult people with their own families. And there is a big backlog there, as there is with spouses of permanent residents. But in any event, we tried to make some changes, but it's a very difficult thing to do once you have that in the law. But again, I would say, Professor, that we have several suggestions about closing the back door, but I think keeping the front door open is vital to our nation's well-being.
Let me pick up on who should be coming in, because we have to confront another very big question. I mean, one of the big questions is the employer responsibility and what kind of documentation we all are prepared to carry, et cetera, and show when we get jobs. But the other is what kind of a balance we want in our overall immigration system as between people who come here because they have family connections here and people who come here because there is a work connection or labor market demand of some kind. I mean, I would accept some of what Mark has said about the fact that some of the supply creates the demand, but it is not entirely a question of take away the supply and the demand will go away. We are demographically different than we have been in the past. There is room for more immigration in our labor market. And the fundamental question I think that we've got to deal with is whether we're going to meet that labor market demand through permanent immigration, opening up our system in a way that creates a larger proportion of people who are here for economic reasons, or whether we meet that demand in the way that the President has been talking about and the way that Congressman Colby talks about through a temporary worker program that assumes that people will go back to their country. My own view is that temporary workers may be the best way politically to get a first foothold in the system and to move this issue forward, but that we are deluding ourselves to think that the large share of those people indeed will go back to their country, and that the real answer is confronting the need through our immigration laws of a much larger permanent flow for labor market reasons.
Could I address the back door and the front door both quickly? As far as the back door goes, the approach, the sort of the thinking about this seems to posit it as a Hobson's choice. There's only two alternatives. One, mass roundups, packing people into boxcars and deporting them by the millions in a short period of time. We're not going to do that. We don't have the capacity to do it even if we wanted to. Therefore, some form of legalization, whether it's amnesty or whatever you want to call it, really, I mean, the point is illegal aliens get legal status. The fact is there's something in between, and that is attrition through enforcement. Consistent across-the-board enforcement of the immigration law can take advantage of the churn that already exists in the illegal population, people coming and going, so that each year, instead of the illegal population increasing, we can force it to decrease little by little each year. It's not easy. It's not a magic bullet. It just can actually work. I mean, it's analogous to dieting. I mean, the mass roundup solution is like liposuction. The President's proposal is a magic pill that they advertise on late-night TV that will let you eat all the cake you want and have no effects. The real way to lose weight is you take in fewer calories than you burn up, and that's the only way we can actually, in the long term, make immigration enforcement work. As far as the front door, we aren't Japan or Italy. Actually, our birth rate is almost exactly, even without immigrants, right about at or just under replacement level. Our economy is not only not helped by large levels of low-skilled immigration, it's actually harmed by it, because the natural progression of increases in productivity and technological development are actually slowed down. The incentives are removed. And in a whole variety of other ways that I won't go into, mass immigration is actually uniquely incompatible with the needs and the goals of a modern society in a way that 100 years ago was not true. The immigrants are the same, we are different, and our immigration policy needs to reflect that.
Congressman?
Well, I agree that we need to have an immigration policy that reflects the current needs, but on this back door. If you're going to close the back door, how are you going to simply enforce it? How are you going to say enforcement's what we need? If you say you're not going to have mass deportations, we're just going to enforce the law better. Does that mean just at the border we're going to enforce the law?
No, everywhere. At the workplace,
Everywhere.
illegals won't get bank accounts.
Well, then
they won't get jobs.
that means mass roundups and taking. You're going to.
Well, no, because what we've seen, and then our experience actually has worked in this regard, is that even though we do need to increase the number of people we deport, there's no question about that, but most illegal aliens who leave the illegal population need to be induced to deport themselves. And this actually works. We saw it after 9/11. We actually started to enforce the immigration law, at least with regard to Middle Easterners. We wanted to make sure the Mexicans and the Chinese could keep coming, but the Muslims we focused on. And the largest Middle Eastern illegal alien group are Pakistanis. Half of the Pakistani illegal aliens left voluntarily. They deported themselves because once they got the message that the party was over, they realized that they had to get out. And they did, and it worked. And the point is, this is something we need to replicate across the board.
There may be some other social issues involved in that, but we can leave that for another time here. So.
Speaking of the Pakistanis raises a third question that we wanted to address. What was the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, is now part of Homeland Security. And how has the whole issue of immigration gotten entangled with the issue of terrorism? And has immigration become a lesser priority? Or are there conflicts internally in the agency trying to enforce all of these policies?
Let me just mention one thing, and I'll let my friends who know more about this than I do say it. But when Doris was my guest back in 2002 here at the Kennedy School, she says something that I've used with attribution in the meantime, with clear attribution. Doris said that prior to 9/11, we looked at immigration through the prism of humanitarian instincts and economic policy and family unification and all the different things. But since 9/11, to get back to what Jim said too, she said, you look through the prism of national security and anti-terrorism and the war against terror. And that's really where we are. And that's really quite an impediment, because if you do look at immigration through that prism and that prism alone, and it becomes the preeminent area, if you will, or the preeminent prism, then of course a lot of normal immigration activities are sacrificed and dropped overboard. So it seems to me that we cannot be oblivious of the problems, and just the New York Times carried a piece yesterday or the day before about Canada and about drugs coming in from Canada, big front page story. We can't be oblivious to crime and drug entry. We can't be oblivious to the fact that terror suspects and terrorists themselves will come in not always through the ports of entry but through a border. The truth of the matter is that really is not the immigration issue totally. And if we concentrate too much on that, we lose some of the more nuanced need to look at the subject of immigration.
Congressman, do you want to?
Well, I just, back to your question there of how we really can enforce this, or I think what was about...
The back door.
Well, not the back door, the front door, but your last... The
terrorism,
the connection to terrorism, the connection to terrorism. I mean, they are inextricably linked. There's no question about it. You're always going to have immigration policy linked to some kind of national security issue. But I don't think that you can define your immigration policy based on national security, or vice versa, define the national security policy based on the immigration. You have to have an immigration policy that works from an immigration standpoint. National security is an issue that leads to border security. You have to have border security that works, but we also have to have an immigration policy that works from the standpoint of how people come into the country, once they get into the country, how they're tracked within the country. One of the things that hasn't come out here tonight is that 50% of the people who are in this country illegally didn't come across the border illegally. They simply came in with legal visas and stayed beyond the time of their visa. So we still don't have any system yet in place, and it's a very difficult one to devise as to how you're going to track that and find those people in an open society where you can travel and you can move and you can disappear into the woodwork, which means that we make the issuance of the visas a lot tougher at the other end. And that leads to all the frustrations and problems of people wanting to come to visit their relatives here in the United States. We get these all the time. Half of the entire constituent casework of my office is on immigration issues, and it's always these kinds of things. Why can't my aunt come over to visit me? and these kinds of problems. And so you can't separate the two. They are definitely linked.
When people talk about the connection between conventional immigration and security, it's often disparaged as a kind of opportunistic effort to sort of piggyback immigration in general on terrorism concerns. I'd have to say that because that this is one of the examples of the incompatibility between modern society and mass immigration, and that is that the kind of warfare, the kind of conflict that we are almost certainly going to be facing in future generations is what they call, what is sort of the wonkish term for it, is asymmetrical conflict, asymmetrical warfare. We're not going to be invading Normandy or Okinawa again. The brass ring of this kind of asymmetrical warfare, the conflict of the weak against the strong, is mass casualty attacks against civilians in the homeland of the enemy. And immigration control is job one in confronting that. It is, in fact, I would argue, the most important tool in protecting the homeland from terrorist attacks, because there's all kinds of other stuff that needs to get done, whether the Iraq War had anything to do with that or not, I don't want to get into, but the point is there's a lot of other things that we can do, obviously, but interrupting the terrorists, confounding their conspiracies, making it as difficult as possible for them to operate once they do get in here is job one, and everything else needs to serve that purpose.
Yeah,
so I would have to say they're
really
I'd have
disagree
to
with that.
respond to, first of all, as we know from Oklahoma City, you can have homegrown terrorists,
Right.
Too. And secondly, I think we're better off trying to stop those terrorists at their home base in Afghanistan than waiting until they come to the border.
I agree. I want to kill them before they get here. The problem is that's offense, not defense, and you need to have both offense and defense.
Immigration is not the single most important thing that we need to do where terrorism is concerned, and Lord save us if it were. Intelligence is the single most important thing that we need to do where anti-terrorism is concerned. Immigration is part of what helps intelligence agencies find people if need be. So we certainly need to do better in terms of being sure that we know who's coming to the country, who's leaving the country, who's in the country, which is part of why a very large illegal population is a serious problem in a post 9/11 kind of a time. But immigration, if you're relying on your immigration system to find terrorists as the primary response, it will not only not work, it will also make us a weaker nation, because immigration is incredibly important, not simply to our productivity in our labor market, but the international movement of people, mobility of people across borders is part of the world that we live in. So it is very much an issue of having systems in place that can screen out people that you know are wanted, that allow you to put patterns together that help to do analysis for intelligence agencies, etc. But that should not be the lead of the battering ram.
Let me
Really
emphasize that it's not so much that the immigration tools are the only thing we should focus on, but rather that keeping the bad guys out is what we need to focus on, because if they're not here, they are the delivery systems for the weapons, and if they're not here, or if we can round them up when they are here, that is the primary goal, is to prevent access.
We agree, but what Doris is saying is don't rely on your immigration system to do that, to keep those people out.
This group could continue discussions for quite a while. We'd like to open the discussion now to you. I'd like to lay out a couple of ground rules. We'd like to limit the first several questions to students. So if you're not a student, we're going to ask you to step back. And when you come up to ask a question, we'd like you to identify yourself and keep two things in mind. We know this is a very controversial topic, but the mission of the Kennedy School, one of our missions, is to raise the level of public discourse about important public policy issues. And this clearly fits the definition of an important public policy issue. And second, which is the mantra of every forum, questions are short and they end with a question mark.
Hi, my name is Josh. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College. Congressman Colby touched on this briefly, but I'd like you to elaborate on it, and that's the problem of college students having trouble getting their visas to come study here. I know several people who have had to, drop back a year because their visas didn't arrive on time. One of my best friends is from the Middle East, and he would like to go home to visit his family, but he's not sure if he would be able to get back in the country. It seems like, in the war on terror and in a world where America is increasingly viewed with suspicion abroad, it seems like one of the things we should be doing the most of is, increasing this exchange between America and other countries and encouraging people to come study at our universities. And it seems like that's just something that's not really being done. Can we, in your experience, it seems like this shouldn't be that hard a problem to solve. What can we do tangibly right now to make sure that it's easy for college students to come study from abroad in America?
You've elucidated the conundrum perfectly there. It's a balance, and I don't know exactly I don't think we've struck the right balance. But on the one hand, you've got to maintain some kind of border security, and that means some kind of immigration security. You've got to know who is coming into your country and so forth. But on the other hand, if all you do is say no to everybody, then you've defeated the other purposes that you want to have with an immigration policy, which is to make it possible for people to come and understand and see the American society and learn about it and have the exchange of views and ideas and learn at our universities and so forth. So striking that balance is not easy, but we tend to go, as we do in so many things, we go from one side to the other of the pendulum, and I think the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of making it difficult for students and faculty to get here. We hear this, as I mentioned earlier, as you just pointed out, we hear this all the time of students saying, I don't think I dare go home. I'm worried about whether I'd be able to get back in. So it's a real problem. I don't know how we strike that balance.
I think part of the problem is, frankly, that we have no numerical limit on the number of foreign students we admit, so the number has been increasing very rapidly in recent years. And frankly, the system is choking on it. And I think we need to debate on the whole concept of admitting foreign students. Why are we doing it? What's the point? And we need to think about this a little harder. Every foreign student who comes here, every single one, including all that pay full tuition, are subsidized. Because full tuition, as absurd as it may seem to you guys, given what you're paying here, doesn't not cover the full cost of an education at any institution. And so every foreign student at a state institution is subsidized by the taxpayers. Every foreign student at a private institution is subsidized by the alumni and the endowment fund. And we need to ask ourselves how much subsidy do we want to devote to this, and is it even a good idea at this level?
Well, I don't think it's a bad idea at all. In fact, I think the more the merrier. And I had the wonderful. I had the great good fortune while I was here as a student at my advanced age to live in Lowell House. I'm not sure any Lowellians are here. Great. But a wonderful opportunity to live with the students who come from all parts of the world, and then to spend my days here at the Kennedy School where the students come from all parts of the world. And I learned so much, and I thought I learned a lot in Washington those 24 years, and I did. But I learned so much in those 10 months here at the Kennedy School that I just still am amazed by it. So first, I would say with respect to Mark, it's important that we not stop thinking about every aspect of immigration. But I certainly don't think that this is a really an important point. To get to the question of how can you do some tangible efforts now to ease this thing, I really don't know. So long as Congressman Colby said, so long as the bureaucrats who run this system and issue the visas are themselves under the threat of being, perhaps dismissed from their job if they admit the wrong person, there's going to be a lot of apprehension and timidity on their part to issue these visas. But I just think it's so penny wise and pound foolish to do it this way. We really need more students, because I think you cross-fertilize what's going on in our colleges and universities, and we of course send back to the home countries people who have a better appreciation of what American life really is.
Yeah, my name is Francisco Acuña. I'm from the Kennedy School. And my question is, listening to you, to the panelists today, you talk about a more comprehensive plan for immigration. So I'm thinking from the experience of Spain, Portugal, Italy, how strongly they developed in the last years, thanks in part for the transfer of wealth from the rich countries to the south, which in a whole helped the European Union to be a stronger community. Transfer from wealth from Germany to France, Spain, Italy. I'm from Mexico. We are part of NAFTA with the United States. However, NAFTA has benefited most the export sector of Mexico. There's a lot of people.
Can you get to the question?
Well, the question is, could why are we not discussing a more comprehensive plan that will involve sort of a development plan for the south of Mexico and some regions of Mexico, which are actually the ones who are exporting people, not products, instead of just thinking about the border security, etc.
It kind of falls in my area, so let me take at least a quick response. Obviously, in the long run, that's the solution. It's economic development, whether we're talking about Mexico or whether we're talking about Honduras or whether we're talking about Ethiopia or whether we're talking about Sri Lanka. I mean, that's the kind of thing, economic development that reduces the pressures on those people to come here. There's a limit on how much we can do, however, in that regard. I mean, I'm chairman of the foreign operations. I know what we do in foreign assistance, but you take a major, big country like Mexico, we could pour every dollar we had into one country like Mexico, and you're not going to solve the problem of economic development there. But there are some more things that we can do to encourage greater amounts of economic development in those countries, which usually ends up coming back to reforms that have to be made in those countries. That's one of the problems in the case of Mexico. We're not here tonight to discuss the economic problems there, but Mexico didn't follow through after NAFTA with some of the major reforms that it needed to make in order to make what you said is the export sector, make it work better when it came to things like agriculture and so forth. So they haven't done some of those reforms. So we do need to do more of that, but economic assistance or development is clearly in the long run, the only solution to this problem.
And I'd add another caveat to that. Yes, in the long run, it is the solution, but the long run could be a very long time.
For a very long run.
And the interesting thing is that in between here and there, immigration pressures actually will increase.
Yes.
Because a country that is or a region that is completely isolated has no paved roads, nobody has any idea what's going on in the outside world, doesn't send immigrants. It's only once development starts a little bit, people get some resources, people get some information about the outside world, that they then want to emigrate. And that was the big problem with NAFTA, is that people weren't thinking about what we were going to do with all of the people who were going to be cut loose from the land, and arrange for them to move to Guadalajara or Mexico City or Monterrey rather than move to Chicago or LA.
Well, when I was here, Carlos and I became friends, and we've talked many times about perhaps his going into government when his time here at the Kennedy School is finished. And I think that gets back to what we said before about having students come from abroad because they learn and they teach us as well as we teach them. But I think the idea of trying to do something with both the push and the pull factor is very important. As Congressman Colby said, it's a very tangled issue, and it involves a lot of working together and a lot of time, a lot of months and years. But certainly that is one element of this whole problem of solving the immigration issues.
Alexandra.
This is to Mr. Krikorian. I'm not sure if the diet metaphor is maybe appropriate in this context.
Because it's not appropriate in my context.
Anyway. Alexandra, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Alexandra. I'm a second-year MPP student here at the Kennedy School. The metaphor strikes me as comparing immigrants to sort of an unsightly growth, a product of excess, weakness, something that should be burned off. And of course, this overlooks all the contributions that some of the panel has cited that immigrants make to our economy. Not just by keeping consumer prices low, but by starting small businesses. And these are things that can be measured pretty directly and sometimes indirectly. It seems you have a bit of more of a difficult task to prove the counterfactual, the cost to companies in lower productivity growth. So I wonder, how do you prove the counterfactual? How do you prove that companies will actually become more technologically advanced in the absence of immigration?
Let me first talk about the 2 points you said were measurable. We have in fact measured them. Immigrants are not any more entrepreneurial than Americans, in fact slightly less so. That's one of the consequences of mass immigration over the past 30 years. Immigrants do not have much, if any, effect on keeping prices down, because all low-skilled workers, immigrant and native, legal and illegal, put together, only consist of something like 4% of GDP. So, frankly, doubling the wages of just the immigrants, doubling the wages of low-skilled workers isn't going to have much effect on prices overall. But as far as your question about proving the counterfactual, the fact is there's plenty of instances where we've seen this kind of thing go on. Let me just point to just One, sugarcane harvesting in Florida. Now, we probably shouldn't have any sugarcane growing in Florida. This is exactly the kind of thing we can do to help the sending countries is stop protecting the growth, the harvest of sugar. But the fact is it exists. And so given that we have a sugarcane industry in South Florida, until the 80s, it was Jamaican workers who were brought in on contract, legal workers, did the sugarcane harvesting, just like they did in the Middle Ages. I mean, it was shirtless, sweaty men with machetes hacking sugarcane. Well, because these people came in on contracts, H-2A, H-2 and H-2A visas, there were certain requirements the employers had to fulfill. The employers didn't fulfill them. They shortchanged them all the time. They didn't pay them what they were supposed to do, didn't give them their housing, etc. So the legal services people down there started suing the employers. And the thinking was, boy, we're going to get these workers the pay they deserve and full compliance with their contracts. What they did was raise the real price, the real wage that these guys were being paid, the effective cost to the employers. So the employers, guess what? They didn't say, boy, we need to honor these contracts. What they did was say, okay, now the cost of these people is more than it used to be, so darn it, we're just going to buy the machines. So they eliminated all of the jobs for these contract workers, and 100% of sugarcane in South Florida is now harvested by machine. This is something that happened only over the past 15 or 20 years, and now what we have is instead of 100 foreign workers using machetes, you have one American or legal worker driving a combine and working in essentially a civilized modern form. That's what controlling and restricting the flow of foreign workers will result in.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Maggie Esby-Katz, and I'm a student in master's degree program here at the Kennedy School. And I wanted to follow up on the second question, actually, and give a twist to it, because a number of us, for our thesis, are working with clients, both the World Bank and with the Inter-Americas Fund, and on looking in different regions on how remittances and immigrants can empower their communities to do the community development, so that it's not about economic assistance, but it's about how immigrants are can more meaningfully assist their communities. And it seems to be a very powerful new philosophy in the international development community, but I'm not hearing this dialogue in the American debate. So I was wondering if this is being incorporated at all, and how, if it's not, as it is incorporated, this could change the frame of the debate.
I'm not sure I follow the question, but I do know that there are billions upon billions of dollars in remittances which are sent to many countries of the world, and of course, particularly, I guess, to Mexico. And while that does assist in economic development back home, villages and towns have sprung up, quite nicely because of money sent back home by people from that area. That's really not the answer either. In other words, if people want to send their money home, that's wonderful, and if they're here legally under a temporary program or a more permanent program, as Commissioner Meisner suggests, then money will be sent back, but now that's the way it ought to be. But as an economic development tool to permit, if that's the question, illegal entry in order to have money sent back to the sending countries in order to have them develop, I'm not sure that is the kind of answer to this tangled question we want.
Remittances are a very important part of an economic development program, it seems to me, but it's an informal one. It's not one that we measure, at least as part of the government, in terms of how we appropriate and decide where our dollars are going to go. But there's increasing evidence, as you say, that it's being used here as these people become more sophisticated in the United States, that they're using this to direct development in their hometowns and their states and their localities where they come from, that they are demanding more at home, more accountability from the political leaders in their home cities where they're sending this back to be sure that this money is being spent in the right way. So it does have the possibility of being a very important tool. But I don't think you can think of it as part of an immigration policy. It just happens to be a spin-off that is there, and I don't think you can develop an immigration policy based on the remittances issue. But the remittances are becoming an increasingly large part of the flow of capital going into these countries.
Let me just add that I think that One of the real dangers, because the amounts now, if you're studying it, you know, are so substantial that, you know, it's the largest source of foreign exchange for some countries and for others the second largest. So these sending countries have an enormous increasing institutionalized interest in what it is that we do here with immigration policy, because they are terrified that might be reduced. But fundamentally, that money is household survival money. Even with the kind of efforts that are being made, they're still embryonic to actually have a more you know, composite effect to that money. And what I worry about with remittances is that it gives developing countries an out. I mean, there is a sort of a new philosophy developing that I think is quite dangerous, which is that somehow or another development should be done on the backs of the money that the poorest people, the poorest wages, you know, are then eking out to send back home. Fine that money is going back home, and fine that those families are being able to do better, but that doesn't in any way, I don't think, absolve those countries from having a development plan, from really making credit markets available, from dealing with their own infrastructure. You know, remittances are not going to create highway systems that bring people to markets, etc. So I think it's really a both and, not an either or, and a lot of the literature is either or-ish.
Yeah, I just want to add that another problem that is sort of related to what Doris said is that these remittances create a kind of dependency mentality, either both individually and on a national scale. And I'm sure there are ways of structuring it in order to make it more productive, so it goes into development rather than buying Pepsis for the deadbeat brother-in-law who didn't want to come here. But there are also other downsides that you need to think about from our end. First of all, millions of dollars in U.S. welfare payments end up being remitted back home. Number two, what we're talking about is, and this relates to what Doris said, some of the poorest people in the poorest communities in the United States are, instead of using the capital to buy a home or send their kids to college or buy a second hot dog stand so they can increase their business, are sending it home because these people often expect that they're going to go home, and they're not. So in other words, the long-term investment that people who are going to end up staying is not being made in the communities and in their own families. It's being diverted elsewhere. So, I mean, there are pluses to it, but there are a lot of minuses that people don't want to talk about.
I have to say, people are not sending welfare money home.
Yeah,
yes, there is. No. Ed, no, excuse me. Economist at UC Davis has actually done work on this. And the fact is that millions of dollars that are being sent, I don't mean the checks are co-signed and sent back to Michoacan. I'm talking about people who collect cash and non-cash benefits, remit a significant amount of money back home. And so, I mean, I don't know how you avoid the conclusion that taxpayers are indirectly sending money back in remittances.
Good evening. My name is Nancy Chidas, and I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School. Professor Wilson referred to the fact that the discussions about immigration in this country sometimes use a language that really has no place in civil public policy debate. And I reflect on that, and I'm thinking that language usually, you know, the more venomous, the stronger language, is directed towards the immigrants themselves. And I find it very puzzling that someone could focus so much energy and attention on what I see as one half of the equation, and many of you referred to the fact that we may need to focus more of the enforcement on employers, and I would agree with that. I think the long-term sustainable solution is focused on the employers. Specifically, Mr. Krikorian made a suggestion that it might be possible to have, I think you said, to have the immigrants stay home and pick the strawberries at home. Now, my feeling, just reflecting on actual, you know, looking at what happens when corporations, say U.S. corporations, go into other countries, go into Mexico, they take over the domestic agriculture, and they pay a wage that, if someone is fortunate enough to get a job, and it is fortunate because they do pay the minimum wage, you may make, you know, $20 a week, which, you know, doesn't buy you a pair of shoes. So I'm wondering, the next time we see a bill in Congress about long-term sustainable solutions to immigration issues, are we going to see an effort to enforce the behavior of U.S. firms abroad and how they influence the economic development of those countries?
Well, I don't know who that's directed to. I just think the link there is a very, we hear that all the time. We hear that, of course, in the trade agreements. You know, if we need to have better enforcement of environmental laws, we need to have better enforcement of labor laws in foreign countries. I mean, it really, I think, ill behooves us to tell other countries exactly what their labor laws should be. I think we should insist on some basic standards, and we do that through International Labor Organization standards. But it does not make sense for us to try to say to a developing country, you have to conform to our standards, labor standards, or our environmental standards. I've traveled a lot, and I've been in these countries, and I've been in a lot of these plants that are owned by American firms, the large firms, and they are, for the most part, pretty much state-of-the-art plants in terms of working conditions. Yeah, the wage is not something that you would want to get, but it's a better wage, I can tell you. I'm thinking of going to certain electronic plants that I've been into in Honduras. It's a lot better wage than they're making outside, and that's why it attracts those people. That's why they move from the countryside into the cities to get those kinds of jobs, because it is better. You see the same thing along the northern border with Mexico. I just think you do get, it's part of the process of economic development. And we know that, for example, on environment, we know that when a country reaches a certain level, it's a per capita income of somewhere around $4,000, that all of a sudden environmental issues become critical, important to them, and they start to devote more of the resources of the country to that issue. So if we can get countries up to that level of development, I think we can do a lot better.
Well, I was reminded when the question came that I think we would be spinning our wheels and wasting a lot of valuable time if we were to devote too much attention to what companies do abroad, either home-owned companies or our U.S. companies that have activities abroad, because this issue continues to fester here. The issue of immigration continues to be a factor at home that we have to deal with. And so I don't think we have that much energy to devote time to that and time to this at home. Also, one thing struck me too, and that is that the tendency we have of not differentiating between illegal immigration and legal immigration gets us into a lot of hot water. You talk about things that will inflame people and excite people and frustrate people. We've reached a point where when we talk about immigration, it's almost like we're talking about illegal immigration. So I think we have to keep these things separate as terms in order to make the debate at least a little bit less heated and a little bit more fruitful.
Hi, my name is Anna DeSouza. I'm a Harvard College sophomore. One of the less prominent bills in Congress right now is called the DREAM Act. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's meant to assist illegal immigrants who are of college age and intelligent and motivated enough to go to college, to not only be able to afford in-state tuition, but also to get their green card through a college education, with some qualifications, of course. And this has been described as very enlightened public policy, but the Bush administration kind of halted it right now, even though it was introduced by a Republican senator. So I just want to know what are your feelings on this bill? Do you think it's going to improve the situation or going to stall it?
Well, again, maybe because that's something currently in Congress, maybe I should address it at least first here. I'm a co-sponsor. I'm a supporter of the DREAM Act. I think it's a good approach. It's a matter of resources and how many dollars you want to apply to this and at what level they come from. Do they come from? Some of the states, by the way, have done this. We've done it in Arizona. And it just depends on how much of the resources you want to devote to this. But I think the concept of it is good.
Well, go ahead, Doris.
Yeah, well, I think that the DREAM Act is one of the, I don't see how you could object to it, really. I mean, these are young people that are totally victims of circumstances. Their parents made the decision to be here and are not in legal status, but we're hurting ourselves as a society, it seems to me, if we make it not be possible for, as you say, the people that are motivated and talented to be able to get a college education. However, I think that it is an example of, I think it's very meritorious, et cetera, but I think it's an example of how fundamentally we're failing at dealing with the issues of immigration overall. It's going after a symptom. And it is, I'm sure Congressman Colby would agree with me, that the kind of political energy that it would take to pass that law You might as well, pass a big reform that actually would make the difference in terms of the underlying circumstances that created people that are eligible for the DREAM Act. And we are going to see more and more of those things where there is an effort to try to deal with this piece, that piece, another piece of what's overall a completely flawed paradigm at this point. Because there is a vacuum. There is a total failure of federal policymaking here on an issue where only the federal government really can take hold of it and try to do something about it. So nothing wrong with the DREAM Act, but it's not really where the action should be.
I think this is another illustration of the back door, the front door. We didn't keep the back door closed, and now we're trying to hit against people in the front door.
They're workarounds.
That's right. So I think it's a failure of the overall policy, but the DREAM Act itself, in its merits, certainly would be advantageous.
If I could only dissent, just because the fact is there is a political purpose to the DREAM Act. It is, in fact, a Band-Aid, as Doris points out, but the political purpose is to find the most telegenic group of people to give an amnesty to, most telegenic group of illegal aliens to amnesty as a sort of camel's nose under the tent. And frankly, if we fix the rest of immigration and radically narrowed the concept of legalizing people not who came here at 17, but people who came here at, say, 4 by their parents, I don't know, that's something at least I could discuss, but not until we address the broader problems.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Paloma. I'm a junior at the college. You've all talked about Simpson-Mazzoli as a historical precedent. I was wondering if you could each talk about the lessons that could be taken from the Bracero program as we move forward with temporary worker programs.
The what?
The Bracero.
Bracero.
Well, she said Simpson-Mazzoli. So
yeah, I was going to say. Well, actually, the Harvest of Shame, the famous documentary that was done that sort of blew the Bracero program out of the water, did in fact show us that, to get back to what I think Mark had said in an earlier answer, unscrupulous employers who did not follow through on their pledge to provide a decent living accommodation, decent wages, decent working conditions, and it was such a scandal that it collapsed and fell apart and was obviously eliminated from the policy of our nation, and deservedly. And so it has infected all of the debates since then about temporary worker programs, because anytime you talk about a temporary worker program, somebody in the audience says, well, that's just another Bracero program, and then you bring back the Harvest of Shame and all of that emotional content. I believe, and Congressman Colby is there, and he knows more about it than me, but I believe you can fashion a temporary worker program that will not have the same flaws and failures and outrages that the Bracero program had. And it's not going to be an easy thing to do, but I think it would contemplate, obviously, protections in the workplace, making sure that there are opportunities for these people who will not be exploited, that they can fight back by filing suit and moving from job to job, doing the things that the Braceros could not do. So I don't think that a temporary worker program is necessarily alike and akin to a Bracero program, but whenever the debate comes up on Capitol Hill, Congressman Colby and his friends have to deal with that as one of the underlying realities.
Could I address them? There's 2 things that we learned from the Bracero program. One is the exploitation. There's no question that's a real issue. The other thing is, though, that it was a real-life social experiment, and that demonstrated beyond all doubt that there's nothing as permanent as a temporary worker. The fact is, no guest worker program in human history has ever worked the way it was advertised, and the Bracero program is one of the factors that created the momentum for today's illegal immigration. I mean, you can't do something like that without creating permanent immigration consequences. I would have to say that's the chief lesson that we've learned from the Bracero program.
But I would say that anything that's as dynamic as something like an immigration policy, you could say that about any part of immigration policy, that it's never worked exactly as it was intended or as it was drafted. And you could say that about almost any kind of legislation that we work on there in Congress. So I don't think that's a very good argument to say the Bracero program or other guest worker programs have never worked precisely as they were intended to work.
I'm not saying precisely. I'm saying the concept of a temporary worker program is you use a person's labor and then you dump them when you're finished with them. People don't work like that. Immigrants are people too. They're created in the image of God, and they have their own objectives, their own goals. They're going to start to get rooted in society. They're going to like the way it is here rather than the old country. And everybody who's tried this unless it's under the most rigid prison-like circumstances, like you might have in some countries of the Middle East, it doesn't work. And I would rather have an American immigration policy instead of a Saudi Arabian immigration policy.
Well, that's why our legislation does have a provision so that you don't have a fixed date at which that person must return home.
But the president has insisted on that. I mean, the president has drawn a line in the sand that people are going to be expected to go home. Rhetorically. Maybe he didn't mean it.
We have time for 2 more questions. Let's move right up here.
Thanks very much. My name is Mark Linton. I'm an MPP student here at the Kennedy School, and I want to thank the panel for coming tonight. It's been a great conversation. The one comment from Mark that I agree with tonight was the last thing he said. That temporary worker programs historically haven't worked. And the discussion tonight that's resonated with me, the part of it is the theme that there are many jobs, labor needs that are driving the demand for immigration right now. It seems the area where Republicans and Democrats are willing to work together on immigration reform. I also hear, though, the danger that we're going to create an entire class of second-class citizens. So my question is, people who come here and work, given the history of our country being one of the only countries in modern history to be founded by immigrants, and the future of the country, where we want it to go, ought they not be given the right to become full citizens if they work here? And what other labor provisions do we need to put in any kinds of legislation to make sure that they're not exploited, that they're not treated as second-class citizens? Because frankly, in reality, labor laws don't apply to immigrants the same they do to Americans. There are language barriers, there are poverty issues. I wonder if the panel could talk about that.
Well, I'd say I could answer that in just a sentence. I think you have to have a path to permanent residency, and our legislation does that.
And I'd like to point out that what that means is that the temporary workers are indentured servants for a certain period of time. And I'm not using that indentured servitude in a figurative sense. They are literally indentured servants. Because when people came in the 17th and 18th centuries, they couldn't afford, there was no way to get here otherwise. They bonded themselves to the ship captain. He sold the contract to the employer in the colonies. And they had 7 years where they had to work, at which point they then got permanent residence. It was a path to permanent residence.
No, ours doesn't work that way.
This is a modern version of indentured servitude. And whatever number of people we take, and I think it needs to be low, they need to be admitted as prospective members of the community, green cards.
I would think that if I'm not mistaken, Congressman Colby's bill and the other bills that are pending will give these workers a chance to shift employers.
Yes, it's portable.
So in other words, you're not indentured to an employer. You do have to work. You have to show a work record, but there's no indenture in this.
You're indentured to the United States. You stop working, you're booted out. So, I mean, I don't really see the difference, quite honestly. This reflects how our immigration policy has been driven by what I would describe as an anti-immigrant high immigration approach. The libertarian approach to immigration, to let in large numbers of people but make sure they don't get too comfortable. And that really is increasingly reflected in the proliferation of guest worker programs and other aspects of our immigration law that really reflect essentially the Wall Street Journal's immigration approach, even though people on the left imagine they're somehow winning this debate.
Our last question.
Thank you very much. I am a student, though not here, and a part-time student, so I kind of squeeze in on that.
Squeeze in as a student.
Former Congressman Mazzoli, I think you made a good point, especially one that applies here in Massachusetts, where no distinction is made between legal immigrants and illegal aliens in this Commonwealth. Of course, it's a huge problem in this Commonwealth. You also made the comment that you have difficulty in Washington getting anything done because of ambivalence. Now, I live in Weymouth, Massachusetts, and we have an increasing problem with the illegal aliens. And while you can have this dispassionate, rational discussion, I have a question for Congressman Colby. We know that there are 8,000 to 10,000 illegal aliens crossing the border each day, approximately 4,000 coming across the border in Arizona.
Half of them in my state. Sorry.
Pardon me?
Half of them in my state.
Yeah, included among those are, drug runners, criminals, and possibly terrorists. So it's difficult to understand why more can't be done, from your standpoint, to do more to seal the borders and control the borders and prevent all these illegal aliens from coming across.
Well, I invite you, and Doris Meisner has been there and seen it, I invite you to come to the border. I've flown every mile of the border from the Colorado River over to New Mexico, And let me tell you, that's one hell of a border. It's rugged, it's difficult, it's impossible to talk about. Sealing the border is just not a realistic answer. You just are not going to seal that border. Now, I did have somebody at one of my town halls say, I've got the answer. He said, I know how you can fix this problem. Put a landmine every 5 feet and give every rancher an AK-47. That'll take care of it. And he was dead serious about it. Sat down there. I don't think that's the kind of immigration policy or enforcement policy we want to have.
Has anybody ever tried to put political pressure on President Fox of Mexico?
Well, you know, President Fox to do what? To suddenly make his country rich and wealthy and have all the jobs that he wants there? I think President Fox should have been doing a lot more than he's done. I'm disappointed with a lot of the policies that President Fox or that the Congress has failed to adopt. It's a multifaceted political problem in Mexico. But I just don't think that saying put more pressure on President Fox is really going to be a huge part of the answer. We need to have more cooperation with President Fox, with the Mexicans, on a lot of things dealing with immigration, on notification, on repatriation, a whole lot of things that I think we need to have improved cooperation on. But in the end, our immigration policy is our policy, and we have to enforce it. We can't rely on the other countries to enforce it for us.
Well, we'd like to see more enforcement. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank the audience. This has been a provocative discussion.
Thank you.